Hello, welcome back. Christopher Taylor with Sovereign Harmony. Hope everyone's doing okay. So we're coming up on the end of 2019 and the end of a decade, actually. So 2020s are right on the horizon here, just a few weeks away. And I wanted to, first of all, talk about the eclipses coming up here over the holiday period, and then 2020, the year ahead. I'll give a brief look at the decade ahead, but if you wanted to join me tomorrow, that's December 10th, today's Monday the 9th, but tomorrow on the 10th at 9 p.m. Eastern or 6 p.m. Pacific or whatever that is for where you are, I will be doing a webinar, free webinar, and if you see this on YouTube, I'll put a link in the description so you can click on that and register for that. But that'll be going on for about an hour and a half, I'd say, and then it'll be online as well. I'll put that on YouTube too. So that'll be a more comprehensive look at the decade ahead. Today, we're just going to talk about the year ahead and start out with the eclipses that are coming up. So, it's been a pretty active, crazy year, especially politically speaking in 2019. All kinds of zealotry, like I've talked about in other videos previous to this. All that zealotry going on both sides of the wall, essentially, and no one really winning any battles, essentially. And of course, now we have the impeachment hearings and everything else in the U.S. Going on as well. It's interesting because it's on the level of power and power in how it's incorporated, how people are governed, etc. That really has to do with the sign of Capricorn, and it's the sign of Capricorn that's really in focus here at the start of the year in January, and for the start of this decade in 2020, we're going to have, for the first time, I think it's only happened a few times in the last 2,000 years, where we have Pluto, Saturn, and Jupiter all in Capricorn. Jupiter just entered Capricorn on December 2nd, so last week. It'll be there until about the solstice of next year, when it meets with Saturn and they both move into Aquarius together, essentially. But we'll get to that in a minute. But the idea being is this focus on Capricorn, the organizational structure, government, that's the energy that's really powerful right now, the real focus. And a lot of these cycles are beginning in 2020, which we'll hint to as well. The eclipses that will lead us into 2020, we have one on Christmas Day, December 25th. It's the solar eclipse at 4 degrees Capricorn, so big surprise. And that will be joining Jupiter in Capricorn. Okay, and then the eclipse we have January 10th, so just fresh into the new year, will be a lunar eclipse that's at 20 degrees Cancer, which is the opposite side of Capricorn, and where the nodes are currently located in between the Cancer North Node, Capricorn South Node, which will also be switching this year, and we'll get to that as well. But that's been a strong focus. There's a lot of focus on decisions being made, policies, etc., and the implications of those. Okay. Now, so this first eclipse on Christmas Day, this one here, like I said, will join Jupiter. And so it kind of like, it's like a welcoming party for Jupiter. Jupiter just entered Capricorn, and now here we go with this eclipse. And you can bet that this impeachment stuff and all the related nonsense there is going to be amplified, etc., as we move immediately into the new year. I don't see any way around that. And whichever way it goes, it doesn't really matter. What matters right now, energetically speaking, is that we set ourselves on the right course. Because what's set up now would have far-reaching effects. There's cycles starting now, 3 major cycles in 2020 that all initiate in Capricorn, and they're going to be far-reaching for the next several decades. Okay, so going back to that eclipse, so it's highlighting that Jupiter, it's a welcoming party for Jupiter, and expect more of the same over the coming months as far as power against power. Right, and that's right now we have a pretty strong political divide no matter where you are in the world, and it's one side wants globalization, the other side wants sovereignty, and that's essentially the battle. That's the age-old battle, essentially. That's right wing, left wing kind of stuff, and so the battle is ensuing right now. And this next eclipse on January 10th, that's that lunar eclipse, kind of big energy of release, and it's going to be opposing Saturn and Pluto. I said Saturn and Pluto are going to be making a conjunction here in January. So right here in a few weeks, Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which hasn't happened since the early 80s. So it's about a 37-year cycle, and we're coming up to the end of the one that started in the early 80s, and we're starting a new one that'll last about 37 years. So the Saturn-Pluto cycle is very important. When we look back, I'm going to go over this in my webinar tomorrow. When you look back at the Saturn-Pluto, the phases, the conjunction phase was the initiation. When they were squaring each other, there was a battle associated with that. What was initiated occurs, and then we have the opposition of Pluto and Saturn, and then the waning square, and then the cycle completes. And so we can kind of look at that, and it's really falls in line with the whole terrorism concept, which, if you look back at the early 80s, what was initiated, this is when you have like governments like the US funding rebels and giving them weapons and things like that, essentially creating terrorism at that time. And by the time we got that cycle culminated, halfway through the cycle, when Saturn was opposite Pluto, this is when essentially 9/11 happened, okay? And so you can see the links energetically, timing-wise, how that worked out. That doesn't mean that the Saturn-Pluto conjunction this time around has to do with terrorism. It doesn't. This one in Capricorn is going to, have a lot more to do with big government organizations and organizations in general, okay? As far as the future direction, like what's decided in 2020 is going to have far-reaching effects throughout the next few decades, okay? We also have, and so going back to that eclipse, so that lunar eclipse is going to oppose Saturn-Pluto. So this is going to really highlight that aspect, that really the importance of that conjunction. It's actually the Sun and Mercury will actually be conjunct Saturn and Pluto at the same time. So it's going to be kind of a 4-planet conjunction right around that time of that second eclipse, that lunar eclipse. So, and it's got that energy of release. So it's just like, this has the energy of long-standing systems crumbling, essentially. If you can think of that analogy, what has stood kind of falling apart, and not falling apart indefinitely, but having to reorganize itself because it can no longer sustain its own weight, essentially. Like for example, with the impeachment thing, one side of the argument is, oh, we've got a corrupt president and we've got to get him out of there. It's unconstitutional, this and that. The other side of it is, all the corruption that's being exposed from other people. We all know Trump is who he is, so it's not that big a deal to think that Trump is corrupt. It's like, yeah, no kidding. But the idea that other people are getting uncovered, and that's kind of, I go over this tomorrow in my webinar too. If you look at Trump's chart energetically, that's kind of his job right now. His job is not to be president. His job is to expose corruption. Not that he isn't part of it, but that's the whole point. He's kind of the fall guy. He's the scapegoat. And all the corruption that's always existed is kind of funneling through him, if you want to think of it that way. And so this energy of this falling apart of the old structures could very well be, a sense of the collective kind of turning their backs on government and organizations like it, and kind of waking up to the idea of how we've always been swindled and bamboozled, and how corruption has always been a big part of our history, even if the media was turning a blind, or not showing us that. Their job before was not to show us. Now their job is to show everything Trump does, for example, but it's no different than anyone else before him. It's just a different way of presenting it. So there's a perception shift in a lot of people's psyche at this point. And I think it's all part of it all crumbling. It's all going to start crumbling here in 2020, and right away, right in the beginning here. I think it's not going to waste any time. I think in the first few months of 2020, we're going to start seeing certain crumblings. We got an election year in the U.S. in 2020, and it could, one side of the fence doesn't even have a really viable candidate at this point, and maybe the whole system breaks down, and it's not going to be, maybe it won't be the same, choose this or the other kind of candidate. Maybe all of a sudden we have to readjust, and there's other ways to elect, other ways to do things. I mean, there's lots of ways this could manifest itself, but it's a very strong energy, a very purposeful, not permanent, but semi-permanent energy, in that it has long-standing effects. So what is decided now? And with the, like I mentioned, so Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto are all in Capricorn. But Jupiter won't meet up with Pluto until about April. From April to November, Jupiter will be with Pluto. That's another initiation of a cycle, which in this case, that one is a shorter cycle. It's about 13 years. This one started about 2007. So this cycle, Jupiter-Pluto, started about 2007. It's ending. The new one is beginning. And then we have, by the time we get to the end of the year, 2020, right around the solstice, so a couple days before Christmas, we have Jupiter catching up with Saturn in Capricorn. And both planets will essentially join each other as they're crossing from Capricorn to Aquarius, which is highly significant because it really suggests that the work is done at that point. The work that had to be done is done, however you want to interpret that. But it seems like by late fall, early winter next year, there's a sense of what needing to be done to break down the old corruption. It's on the move. You know, maybe there's high-level people that we didn't expect, you know, having to, you know, appear in court, or whatever it is, you know. This just kind of harks back to all the, you know, all the high-level people's involvement with Epstein and, you know, in the Epstein suicide and everything else. So we don't know how this is all going to play out. This past year, 2019, was a lot of disclosure as well, a lot of like information, people doubting what stories they're hearing, etc. Because there's so much zealotry and more belief than actual facts backing people's passions, essentially. And so it's kind of thrown a lot of sticks in the air, essentially, and we're going to have to see where they all land at this point. But that's the energy of those three cycles. And that Jupiter-Saturn cycle, again, another initiation of a cycle, that's a 20-year period, roughly. That last conjunction was in the year 2000, in May of 2000. We had a Saturn conjunct with Jupiter, Saturn, Jupiter. And so we have a 37-year cycle, Saturn-Pluto, 20-year cycle, Jupiter-Saturn, and a 13-year cycle, Jupiter-Pluto, all ending and reinitiating this year, 2020. So it's a very important year for setting a precedent forward, and this precedent has a lot to do with ridding corruption, getting rid of the, you know, the heaviness of collective organizational structures, okay, and how they work and operate and everything else. So that's a big theme for the year and the precedent it will set for the entire decade. So it's very, very important. Okay, so that's some of the things that make this year a little bit different. Another thing happening when we get to early May, I think it's May 4th, that's when the moon's nodes, I mentioned them earlier that they're in Cancer and Capricorn right now, but they're going to switch to Gemini and Sagittarius. So we're going to back into those signs. And so that's going to be a shift. So our eclipses right now have been falling for the last year or so, falling in the Cancer Capricorn area, which is where they're going to fall here Christmas Day and January 10th. The next one's coming up by late in the year. We have a couple of eclipses. They'll be more moving into Gemini Sagittarius zone. So it's a shift in the focus. So all this focus on government organization, corruption, etc., it's really at the forefront of the beginning and middle of 2020. And we have a shift kind of as the work is completed by the end of the year. And, you know, completed, the work is never completed totally, but the idea is what, you know, the work that had to be done has been done. And you can interpret that, if you're looking at that from a left-wing perspective, you might interpret that as, you know, getting Trump out of office. If you're from the right-wing perspective, you'll look at it from the idea of Trump exposing people and the real corruption, you know, like Joe Biden or whatever, you know, and the idea being that this could play out in both ways, essentially, you know, but the idea is getting it exposed, which again is Trump's energetic job, is to be the scapegoat for corruption, to be what it all moves through, so that people are kind of keen and aware in looking for it, essentially, and that's when you find it, is when you're looking for it, when we're distracted by nonsense on TV and whatnot, and the media can kind of hold a narrative. Well, now if we're, you know, looking at our leaders as corrupt, we're seeing corruption everywhere, and so that's part of what helps break it all down and expose it. Okay, we will have a few extra retrogrades this year too. So in 2019, we just had Mercury retrogrades. other than, I mean, the outer planets go retrograde, but I'm talking about personal planets. So Mercury, Venus, Mars. Okay, those are the three that really matter on a personal level. The other planets, the outer planets, they go retrograde every year for about half the year, almost. So they're really not that big a deal to talk about the retrograde phases for those. Whereas, you know, Mercury does it 3 times a year for 3 weeks, so it's a very specific time period. Venus, once every 18 months or so, goes retrograde for about 5 or 6 weeks, I think, 6 weeks. And then Mars, every 2 years, goes retrograde for a couple of months. Okay? And so those are a big deal. Those are a pretty big deal. And the timing of these ones, when we get to the end of the year in a second, you'll see it's pretty interesting with regards to the 2020 election. But starting in the spring, we're going to have Mercury retrogrades. We just came out of a Mercury retrograde. We had that one in Scorpio in early to mid-November. I talked about that in my last video. This one that one coming up next won't be till mid-February, so mid-February to early March. This one's going to be in early Pisces, backing into late Aquarius. So that zone of your chart is going to be where there's some introspection, some reconsolidation, etc. So you can look that up for yourself. And after that, right after the nodes change signs, May 4th, about a week later, Venus goes retrograde. And Venus is going to retrograde in the sign of Gemini completely, so the entire retrograde will be just in the sign of Gemini. And that's going to be from about mid-May to late June. Okay? And so that has like a Mercury retrograde, except now it's a focus instead of on things Mercury related, like communication, travel, etc. Venus has more to do with money and relationships and aesthetics, etc. And so there can be some reorganization on those levels. Then we get to the summer, and we have another Mercury retrograde, and that one is going to be mid-June, so before the Venus retrograde is even over. About a week before that finishes, Mercury will go retrograde, so we'll have both Mercury and Venus retrograde in mid to late June. And that Mercury retrograde will last into about mid-July. Okay? And that one will be, I believe, completely in the sign of Cancer. Yeah. And so that part of your chart is where you want to look for that one. When we get to the fall, this is where it gets really interesting. This is what I was talking about. Mars will go retrograde mid-September to about late November. Mercury will go retrograde from about mid-October to early November. So they'll both be retrograde at the same time. The entire Mercury retrograde in the fall will be occurring while Mars is in its retrograde, because Mars will be retrograding for over 2 months. And so that 3-week period for Mercury is going to be within that, and it's going to all be happening together. And what makes this really interesting, and by the way, Mars will be retrograding in its sign Aries. Mars rules Aries, and it's going to be retrograding completely in the sign of Aries. And so that's very fiery. You know, when it comes to like action, there's a lot. It's Mercury retrograde can be a time of delayed action. Okay, it's an action planet, so we're reconsidering our actions. We're readjusting how we're going about our days, etc. And so that's kind of the purpose of the Mars retrograde. That Mercury retrograde will be starting in, I believe it's going to go from Scorpio back into Libra. Yeah, so it'll be an early Scorpio back to Libra, and then it moves forward again. But the day of the election in 2020 in the US, November 3rd, is the day that Mercury goes direct. And at that time, Mars will be stationary. In other words, it'll have about a week or so before it moves direct, and it will be essentially on the same degree, about 15 degrees Aries, the entire, like leading up to the election for a few days and several days afterwards, just sitting there. So there's lots of shenanigan potentials, let's put it that way, with things crumbling throughout the year, like I'm talking about as far as exposure and corruption, etc. We get to this election, and there's something about it that just there's something that doesn't want to run smoothly. Let's put it that way. So it doesn't appear like it's going to run smoothly. There's probably going to be some underhanded action. Mars retrograde, again, Mars forward, it's direct. Mars retrograde is kind of passive aggressive. It's tricks. It's, you know, schemes. Okay, and on both sides, who knows, right? No good guys, no bad guys, just a bad system. And so I would expect some shenanigans. Let's put it that way. During the election cycle of this year, mostly due to that Mars retrograde, Mercury retrograde. It just kind of indicates at the time period, I wouldn't plan an election during that time if I was looking at things the way I look at things. I would wait till Mars goes direct and do it maybe in late November. But it's going to happen when it happens. So the universe is going to do its thing. Okay. And so, anyway, that pretty much sums up 2020. It's very, I'm trying to do it as little as I can, but there's a lot to get out there. So we have 3 Mercury retrogrades, a Venus retrograde in the late spring, early summer, Mars retrograde in the fall. That ends right after the election, with Mercury retrograde ending on the day of the election. We have the nodes changing signs in early May from Cancer Capricorn to Gemini Sagittarius. That's going to shift some things a little bit. And we have these 3 major cycles initiating. That's Saturn Pluto in January, Jupiter Pluto from April to November, and then we have Jupiter Saturn right around the solstice at the end of the year. And so all major cycles, all setting a precedent for the rest of the decade, as well as a few decades even further than that. So big times, big things happening. And if you want to join my webinar tomorrow, it is at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 Pacific, and it's a Zoom webinar. And so you just register, and then you just click on that link, and it's gonna you can get there while I'm already started and running these slides and everything. And I will record it, so if you can't make it, it's going to go in the same place this is going, so you'll see it on the YouTube channel as well. So hope that helps you out there. If you have any questions, let me know. If you're interested in a reading, let me know. And hope to see you on the webinar. If not, I will make sure you get the information anyway. All right, thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you again.